What does it really mean to be a pastor's daughter? Is it faith without questions, strength without struggles, or perfection without mistakes? The truth is, it is so much more than that. Beyond the expectations, beyond the assumptions, and beyond the title, there is a story of faith, a story of family, a story of growth, healing, and becoming. Welcome to Diary of a Pastor's Daughter. I'm Deborah. Come along with me as we turn the pages, one story at a time. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Diary of a Pastor's Daughter. Yay! I honestly cannot tell you how excited I am to finally be having this conversation with you. For a long time, this podcast existed only in my thoughts. It was one of those ideas that kept coming back to me over and over again. And today, I'm grateful that you're here listening to the very first episode. This podcast is going to be a space for honest conversations, not perfect conversations, not polished conversations, but honest. We're going to talk about faith, we're going to talk about family, we're going to talk about church culture, identity, freedom, expectations, parenting, ministry, healing, growth, and everything that comes with navigating life as a pastor's daughter. But before we dive into all of that, I thought it would be fitting for us to get to know each other first. So whether you're listening while driving, doing laundry, taking a walk, or sitting with a cup of coffee, settle in. Let's chat. Who am I? My name is Deborah, and depending on where you know me from, you may know a completely different version of me and even a completely different name. Some people know me as a pastor's daughter. Some know me as a school friend. Others know me as a women's advocate. Some know me from the workplace. And some simply know me as a friend. The interesting thing about life is that people often know one chapter of your story and assume they've read the entire book. But each of those identities only tells a part of who I am. I was born in Ondo State, Nigeria. I grew up with my brother. I just have one sibling. Like many others, I grew up with a lot of relatives. And like many people, my life has been shaped by different seasons, different experiences, different relationships, and different lessons. Professionally, I work in the financial industry. Now, I know that may not be what some people imagine when they hear the phrase pastor's daughter. Maybe some people imagine that I spend all day in church. Maybe some people imagine that ministry is my entire personality. But one thing you'll discover throughout this podcast is that there are many layers to my story. I am also a wife. I am a mother. I am a woman of faith. And perhaps most importantly, I'm someone who is still learning, still growing, still evolving, still becoming. I don't sit here today claiming to have all the answers. I don't have life figured out. I don't have a perfect testimony. I don't have a flawless faith journey. What I do have is a story. And that's really what this podcast is about. Sharing the journey, sharing the lessons, sharing the mistakes, sharing the victories, sharing the moments that strengthened my faith and the moment that challenged it. Because there is one thing I've learned, it's that growth often happens in the places we least expect. Now let's talk about the title of this podcast, Diary of a Pastor's Daughter. What was it actually like growing up as a pastor's daughter? The truth is, being a pastor's daughter wasn't something I became aware of later in life. It was one of the earliest things that I know about myself. Long before I could tell you what 2 plus 2 was, I already knew there were expectations attached to who I was. I knew there were things I should do, things I shouldn't do, ways I should behave, ways I shouldn't behave. I knew what was expected of me before I fully understand why those expectations existed. Growing up, church wasn't simply somewhere we went. Church was life. Ministry wasn't something my parents did on Sundays. It was woven into our everyday lives. People often say ministry is a calling, and that's true. But for the children of those called into ministry, it often becomes part of your environment before you have the opportunity to choose it for yourself. I learned about serving people from a very young age. I learned about sacrifice. I learned about responsibility. I learned about putting people first. And while those lessons shaped me positively in many ways, they also came with challenges that I didn't fully understand until much later in life. Being a pastor's daughter came with incredible blessings. I was exposed to faith from an early age. I saw lives transformed. I witnessed generosity. I saw compassion. I learned leadership. I learned service. I learned that life is bigger than yourself. But alongside those blessings came expectations. Sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken. There was always an awareness that my actions reflected not only on me, but on my family and on the ministry. There was a pressure to get things right, a pressure to be an example, a pressure to avoid becoming a source of embarrassment or disappointment. And if you have grown up in a ministry family, you probably understand exactly what I'm talking about. What many people don't realize is that pastors' children are often expected to be examples before they are allowed to simply be children. People sometimes assume that because your parents are spiritual leaders, you automatically have everything figured out. That your faith is always strong, that you never struggle, that you never question, that you never wrestle with doubt, that you never make mistakes. But the reality is far more human than that. Behind every pastor's child is a person, a real person, a young boy, young girl. Sometimes someone trying to discover who they are, someone trying to understand life, someone trying to navigate fate, someone trying to find their voice. And that realization is one of the reasons this podcast exists. Because so often people are quick to point fingers at pastors' children. People are quick to judge, quick to criticize, quick to use the story of a pastor's child who went astray as an example of failure. But very few persons or people pause long enough to ask what that child experienced, what pressures they carried, what expectations they lived under, what battles they fought in silence, what wounds they never spoke about. And to be clear, this podcast is not about making excuses for anyone. It's not about criticizing the church. It's not about attacking ministry. Far from it. This podcast is about creating understanding. Because sometimes what we see on the surface is only a small part of the story. Sometimes understanding a person's outcome requires understanding the journey they worked to get there. And that brings me to why I'm starting this podcast now. For years, I've carried stories, I've carried lessons, questions, experiences, moments of pain, moments of joy, moments of confusion, moments of clarity. And over time, I realized something. There is power in telling your story. Not because your story is extraordinary, but because your story might help someone else feel less alone. I believe there are conversations many of us have been afraid to have. Conversations about faith beyond church culture. Conversations about expectations. Conversations about identity. Conversations about healing. Conversations about freedom. Conversations about what happens when your faith becomes personal instead of inherited. And I want this podcast to be a place where we can have those conversations honestly. Not from a place of bitterness, not from a place of superiority, but from a place of growth. This podcast is for pastors' children. It is for ministry families. It is for women trying to balance multiple roles. It is for people navigating faith. It is for those carrying expectations. It is for people who have questions. It is for people who are healing. It is for people who are becoming. And even if you've never stepped foot into a pastor's home, I think you would find something here for you too. Because at the heart of it all, this isn't just a story about being a pastor's daughter. It is a story about being human. So what can you expect going forward? One word: honesty. We're going to talk about faith beyond church culture. We're going to talk about expectations placed on pastors' children and ministry families. We're going to talk about marriage and ministry. We'll talk about raising children in a ministry environment. We'll talk about lessons learned, mistakes made, regrets, growth, disappointment, trauma, healing, restoration. We'll talk about the moment that broke us and the moments God used to rebuild us. We'll talk about successes too, because this journey has not been all pain. There have been victories, there have been miracles, there have been beautiful moments of growth and transformation. And I want to share all of it, the good, the bad, the messy, the beautiful, the real. Because I believe authenticity creates connection. My hope is that as you listen, you'll find pieces of your own story reflected somewhere in these conversations. Maybe you'll feel seen. Maybe you'll feel understood. Maybe you'll gain perspective. Maybe you'll find healing. Or maybe you just simply realize that you're not alone. And honestly, if this podcast does that for even one person, it will have been worth it. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for joining me on this first episode. This is only the beginning. There are stories yet to be told, lessons yet to be shared, conversations yet to be had, and I genuinely cannot wait to take this journey with you. Until next time, remember this: every story has chapters that people never get to see. And sometimes understanding begins when we are willing to listen to them. Thank you for listening to Diary of a Pastor's Daughter. I'll see you in the next episode.